the 12th Soil and Nutrition Conference. This is our theme this year is reNaturing ourselves. I'm Dan Kittredge. I'm your host. Looking forward to an amazing 12 weeks of content, brilliant conversations, amazing people, wonderful insights. Welcome all. We have people from many continents here today. I see a number of names I've known for a long time in the attendee list, and the number I don't know. We welcome everyone to engage with each other via the chat link. And if you've got questions that you'd like to pose to Christopher, you'll put those in the Q&A box. We'll be having a presentation for the first hour or so, perhaps a bit under an hour, by Christopher, and then we'll go on to a more of a active dialogue between himself and myself for about half an hour, and then we'll engage the questions from the audience and the attendees. Welcome everyone. Christopher, do you mind turning your camera and your audio back on? There we are. There he is. I'm very, very honored to be hosting Christopher Houghton Budd here today as our opening speaker in this year's conference. I think the theme of the conference this year, the reNaturing ourselves, is we're hoping to have a deep dive into what are the ways in which we're out of tune and out of harmony with the deeper order of the universe. Call that nature, call that as you will. And we're looking with each of our weeks at different aspects. And today the aspect we're looking at is economics. Economics is it's a sea that we all swim in. It's a part of the life that we live. We make so many decisions day in, day out, unconsciously, about our lives, how we organize our lives based on the economic structures within which we live. And I propose that structure may not be entirely harmonious. Christopher is someone who's a deep student in the field. He's at the pinnacle of conversation with people. I think it's correct to say, Christopher, that you not only work with biodynamic businesses globally in how they are, conceiving the economic structure of themselves, but also consult with the Bank of England. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I've been in the biodynamic movement for over 50 years in theory and a little bit of farming, but mainly as a distributor. I still have that connection, and I don't advise the Bank of England, but I attend research meetings and I have connections in that world. Yes.
Well, you go to meetings at the Bank of England.
Yeah.
For anybody who knows anything about economics and knows
Yeah.
who the Bank of England is in the broader global scheme of economics.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want them to hear me saying I'm one of their advisors, because that might be.
I'll take that back. All I wanted to say is that someone who has a foot in each of those worlds, you're I think exquisitely positioned to unpack this deeper conversation for us. So I think I'll let you take it from there, unless there's anything else. I feel like you probably could do a better introduction of yourself than I can, but maybe that framing is valuable. But you're prepared for it.
No, I think that's good. Maybe just to clarify why I assume you've asked me to speak and why I think I can speak on the topic. I'm becoming emeritus, as you can see, but I started my work as an economist and also with farming and these issues in the early 70s. So that's like 50 years or more. And I have a lot of practical experience in running a distribution business and all the issues to do with this. And also, I'm an economic and monetary historian by profession. So I have, as I want to show here, a kind of long understanding, or I think I have, of how we got to where we are, where we might be going. And then I've hung out in practically every school of thought you can think of in economics. So I usually change my clothes to my audience, and I can be in the bank 1 minute, or I can be in the Green Party after lunch, and so on. So I'm fairly eclectic and a bit of a chameleon. But I made it my business, so I'm not really in anybody's pocket when it comes to my understanding.
Yes, and
Okay.
we got a chance to meet in person. I think it was in June at your place, and get to connect and develop a personal relationship there. Thank you to Sarah for that introduction. But yeah, your perspective is wonderful. So I'm honored to be able to invite you to our community.
Yeah. So shall I begin the proceedings then?
Take it away. I'll turn my camera off and let people just focus on
Yeah.
you, and then when you get done, I'll turn it back on and we'll engage the conversation.
So as I said, my background is quite a lot of practical experience in finance and running businesses, mostly smallish, so not corporations, and usually on the, let's say, the organic side of the spectrum. But I've made it my business to look into almost every school of thought. And I'm not an economist. I'm an economic and monetary historian. That means, unlike economists, I have a sense of human history, which modern economics doesn't have. Modern economics is rooted here in 1776, when Adam Smith began so-called modern economics. And a particular feature of modern economics is caught in the circumstances of then, and it casts them backwards and it casts them forward. And this is not very good economic history, because you have to be able to go back to previous times, previous understandings, and imagine it might be different tomorrow. So I want to make that kind of clear, because it means that from an economist point of view, I'm just an irritation. I don't fit happily into market theory and all the rest of it. So what I want to do to start with is just give a kind of general background, and then I may say things which may cause viewers to tear their hairs out. I don't know who's watching or which part of the heavens they're in terms of finance, but it's deliberate in order to, first of all, acquaint ourselves with the neoliberal story, which is everybody's bugbear. But also then I'm looking to Dan to focus me in on any particular topic area you want to talk about. For example, the commons. I'm not going to start out there, but I'm happy to be pulled into that place. So I'm going to begin with this big panorama, which I've just drawn here behind me. The black spots are because I wrote it wrong for the mirror imaging. So I've now written it right. And basically, it's a story that, you know, we came in most cultures around the world, if not all cultures, have some story that we kind of came from the gods, that we came from somewhere, and then we had elders, and gradually we became self-conscious human beings. Not every culture will say that, but certainly from a Western culture, when we get to 1776, which is a time not only of Adam Smith, but of the United States saying, okay, we're done with the European story, we're now our own agents. This is a very key point in history. And I make it the kind of, everything depends on what now happens when we claim, at least economists claim, or at least Adam Smith claim, before then everybody was a savage. They couldn't be expected to understand everything. And this I have a problem with as an economic historian. I don't believe everybody was a savage before Adam Smith. But most economic textbooks will say that's what we were, or that's what they are, especially if they're not white people. And that's another whole dimension. So I'm trying to kind of take ownership of the kind of problems that I have, or I might represent, especially as an Englishman, and especially as a white Englishman. But I think also in my own culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, if you go deep into this, it also has a story of coming from the gods or from somewhere and coming to the elders, and gradually we take charge of our own destiny and we make our own laws and so on. And so that's my first image. And I've located here a particular point, which is, I call it the first Renaissance, because I think that's a key point in history, and the name, that, you know, the clues in the name. So I don't know who came up with the idea of rebirth, but why do we talk about that point in history being a rebirth? It implies we were already born before, and so we're doing it again. And I think you can look at that point in history around the 14th, 15th century, and a lot of quantum change took place, to use a modern term. And I want to come back to that date. Then I've got this turning point, moment when we become masters of our own destiny, as it were. We make our own laws, become democrats. We don't pay attention to kings or gods or any outside agency. At least we pretend not to. And then we go on further, and this image splits. So I'm trying to say we have a choice. We can figure out what we're doing and get back to somewhere more noble than maybe we are at the moment, or we can get trapped, and then we're heading into kind of mess which a lot of modern life is anticipating or already representing. So that's the kind of background story. And here I put the second Renaissance, which for me is a really critical point. This is the time of the First World War, meaning there was also a quantum change in our consciousness around the beginning of what we now call the beginning of the First World War. But if I date it to around 1912, thereabouts, and there was, at that time, you wouldn't say we're at the beginning of the World War. Some people might have smelt something coming. But then you have changes in music, changes in art, the beginning of the Bloomsbury Group, Virginia Woolf, these people, and they were just moving into another dimension, you might say. And all this got forgotten or hidden in the noise of the First World War. I don't mean to denigrate the First World War, but nobody has any image that we had another Renaissance about 100 years or so ago. And so I wanted to put these three moments in, because I think for me they're the key points in the long story of history, and a lot of our problems in economics depend on how we understand this. So particularly if I we're going to get into the enclosures when Dan gets me into it. I'm not going to go into there myself at this point, because there's a prior problem behind what the commons is, and and I just want to kind of identify that at this point in our journey. So if you talk about modern economic life, it has a quality which didn't exist before the first Renaissance. It didn't exist before the 14th, 15th century. Before those days, there was very little monetization of human relationships. So if I take what today we call interest, just as a very simple example, you can link this to inter esse in Latin, mean between things or between people. And so you had relationships. For example, if I make maybe an American version, if your barn burnt down in those days, then the community or other farmers around you helped you build it back up again, and you were obliged to return the favor should someone else's barn burn down. When you monetize that, you end up with the phenomenon of interest. I don't mean interest in ancient terms. I mean just an economic transaction. We can create a fund, and I'll put some money in every week. And when anyone's barn burns down, we'll pay the farmer to go and sort that out of the fund. So you have a huge event happening in the first Renaissance, this monetization of human relationships, and that does two things. It sets us up for a kind of freedom, meaning I don't have to go and help your barn burn down. We can do some division of labor, and we can have a fire engine in the village, and I'll carry on farming, much more efficient, you might say. But also it creates a situation. I can't now see the human relationship, which has now been monetized. And once you have a monetized human relationship, things can come in there which forget they are human relationships. So if I stay with the insurance market, you can create an insurance fund, which is like a kind of credit union. It's a lump of money which you've all put in the pot should anyone need it. But once you have a lump of money like that, you might say, actually, I could get more money for my money if I took it out of the pot and put it in the market. And once you start playing these games, then you're not in a kind of, let's say, controlled human environment. Now you're kind of being driven by all sorts of profiteering motives and other things which come about because of this, because of this technical possibility. So I want to make that example pretty fundamental at this point in the first Renaissance in the 14th, 15th century, because then you will have things like the ancient relationship of landlord. Today, a landlord would be perceived not only as a politically incorrect use of language, because it could be landladies, but landlord, the word lord in origin means the person who looks after everybody who's dependent upon him. So if you go back to times when you had the lord of the manor, the lord meant you had a responsibility to look after everybody on your land. This is not a feudal image, which most people have. They were not necessarily peasants, which is how we would describe them today. They were just the people who, not just the people, they were the people who tilled the fields, and I was responsible for them. And so I take this example because a lord today, or a landlord, would tend to be a pejorative term, but originally it wasn't. So in this story, many things become reversed. I won't say perverted, but they become reversed. And then we forget their true origin. And then we start some other story about I don't like my landlord, and you have landlord-tenant relationships. And the human relationship, which is there between them, becomes obscured and it's monetized. And now we start to play games. So that for me is a very important thing about history. Be very careful how we understand what happened before the Renaissance and what happened since. And if I give a couple of examples, which will play into the common story and others, I would say particularly say from the Medici family time, you have the beginning of the birth of capitalism, in the sense of capital also became monetized. It stood independently of usury laws, church laws, any kind of laws of the elders just disappeared when it came to the merchants of the Medici era, and merchant banks are their heirs. So in this period here, we see the appearance of merchants who are starting to be bankers, and they develop their own sense of what's right and wrong when it comes down to economic transactions. And you have a whole story of usury behind this and so on. But what it is the beginning not only of capital becoming monetized, you can go and get it from a bank, so to speak. It's not embedded in your assets, to use a modern language, but also this capital is now at the disposition of specific individuals who may or may not be subject to family rules, tribal rules, or whatever may have preceded. So now they're going to make up their own rules out of their own sense of what's right and wrong. This is enormously important, because at this point, it's then the modern individual can now take hold of capital and go and do something. Whether they do good or bad with this is the second point. But they couldn't go and do with their own money what they're now going to do. They couldn't do this before the first Renaissance. You did what you were told to do, what your father did before you, what the guilds allowed you to do, and so on. Now you come into a world where it's really up to the human being to create the universe according to his or her sense of values. And we just have to hope that as we go forward, we all have some shared sense of values, not imposed on us, but we discover the same sense of values actually through our anarchy. That's the question going forward. And if we have this image, then of course we're at great risk. If I stick with my drawing, we might lose it. We might just remain anarchic and just do whatever we think is right, regardless of what anybody else thinks or our impact. And this possibility is built into history. This is the foundation for everyone who says, like Adam Smith, just do what serves your self-interest, the world would make it right. And I would say, not sure about that. Nice idea, but I think just looking after yourself is a little bit this curve here. It's not automatically the right thing to do socially or financially. And therefore, I mean by this curve going upwards, getting ourselves out of our present position is about individuals kind of having a higher sense of purpose and not just following their lower interests, which is really what Adam Smith is talking about. And so most of modern economics and also its understanding of economic and financial history is pretty much linked to how we behave when we're only self-interested. It doesn't mean we can't behave with the other in mind, whether it's the rest of my community or the whole world or the economy or the environment. We just don't have the science of this yet, because economics is the science of looking after myself, not looking after the planet, let's say. So these are my big picture stories. And, and the particular topics I just want to touch on from this, or with this as background, are things like the birth of capitalism and how do we understand the real purpose of capitalism in human history. I already touched on monetization of interest. This is very important. Then property rights. What is the purpose of property rights in history? Is it really so that I am all right with my private property, or is some other story why I have property which is for me to look after, as it were. Why I can put a fence around a field, whereas before I wouldn't dream of doing this. There's a story behind property rights, which is very important. And then more technical things is the whole problem, especially in the modern world, of knowing the difference between ownership and use. And for many people, these things are conflated or they're just the same story. But if I own a piece of land, for example, I'm not necessarily going to be the one to use it. If I own it, I have the right to use it, but I also have the right to let someone else use it. So I want to kind of raise that topic because around ownership and use of the use of something and the ownership of something, these are a big difference, and often they're just conflated, and the conflation is the cause of the problem. And then maybe one last larger story in this introductory thing is in this whole journey here, for me, it's quite clear that however we describe it in different cultures around the world, and I think they all have a similar story. We've come from, let's say, we've come from the gods of something. We had elders, and now we're on our own. We have to make up our own version of history, and we have to make up our own rules, and we have to find a way to conduct ourselves, which is socially in its outcome, but not necessarily automatically so because of the way we do business. I have a problem with the neoliberals when they say, if you look after yourself, it will be okay. A visible and invisible hand will sort this out. I think this is fundamentally untrue and unproven. What we have to do is rub up against each other, preferably proactively rather than after the event of a collapse of something or other. So this is my way of saying the whole neoliberal paradigm, from my point of view, is understandable at this point in history, by which I mean late. I'm past the Renaissance. I'm now here in the late 20th century, is where I am, when the neoliberal people achieved ascendancy at the time of Thatcher and Reagan and so on. But what they were trying to say is, in their way of understanding economics, the human being becomes free, which is the whole purpose for them of history. And I think it is for everybody. I just doubt that the way they think it's going to happen is the way it will happen. And now we're in a stage where we've had 40 years of their version of events. And I think they would say, at least my neoliberal colleagues would say, kind of not so loudly as I'm saying it, actually, we made a kind of mistake. We thought in the 1980s that human beings were quite able to manage financial markets. And so we opened the whole world up to financial markets. But in fact, they weren't able to. And so markets took over without any human, in the language, rules took over and no discretion. So we cut the human being out of the equation. And now we simply have to get that human being back in the equation. It may be that markets still play a role against a state-run economy, for example. But it won't be just, I think, it won't just be markets. It'll be markets which are consciously managed by human beings and probably on a lowish scale and scope to begin with. So I think I've said enough to kind of locate us in history. And what I'd like to do, if Dan's up for it, is to get Dan now to say, oh, that's not where I wanted to go. I wanted to go here. And then he can say that, and then we'll go there.
Well, yeah,
Over to you.
over to me.
I can elaborate. I can talk for hours, but I need some. Tell me what you want me to
Yes.
talk.
No, I think, well, I've taken a number of notes here from what you've said, and I think um, one of the problems I'll say with economics and all of this is it's very heady, and being able to take these extremely important insights and convey them in a lay tongue, in a sort of intuitive format, is a real challenge. So I'm looking forward to engaging the conversation with you and seeing what I can tease out. I where to start. Um, I think as I've been thinking about this presentation over the past month or two and looking into Small is Beautiful, Schumacher, all kinds of other sort of angles and perspectives and things like that. There's this one framing that I came across, which was the love economy um, versus GDP, and I think this starts out with what you were saying, prior to the Renaissance, the 1400s, about how the economy worked, and it worked based on mutualism and um, um, not so much actual capital, like in the form of dollars and cents or pieces of metal, but reputation and relationship and that sort of social capital. So one thought I've had recently is, we talk about how the U.S. GDP is whatever it is, $23 trillion, and Kenya's might be $1 trillion. If you measure in actual dollars that are transacted back and forth. Um, but what's being ignored is all the human social capital, the love economy. I think of, the act of raising children, the act of taking care of a home, the act of engaging, in the community are all very powerful forms of engaging capital, if you want to frame it that way. So there's all these like ways we're unconsciously in the box. This has value because you earn money for it. This does not have value, even though you build capital. It's in a different format. So um, I don't think you went fully into, your insights on property rights. I don't think I heard you say what is the real purpose of capitalism in human history. Um, I don't think I heard you delve into ownership versus use. Um, I think we are in this neoliberal world, um, which has, you didn't say it's perverse, but I think it has had some quite perverse implications on human culture, um, and is continuing to, and is a dead end. So I think there's still more work to do to tease out these things. I'm happy to do it in more dialogue than monologue if you'd like. Um, is there anything you'd like to
Okay, well,
respond to there?
yeah, let's try this. So using your vocabulary, which, and I don't know who's watching, so I don't know whose vocabulary, who
We've
speaks
got
what
people from
vocabulary.
Africa, from North America, from Europe, from Australia. It's a
Yes,
broad,
so
diverse
I'm talking
suite of,
blind,
yeah,
and what I say to you may not work for the person next to you, but let's see. But if I because this tends to be what I would do. So from my wide perspective, I'm going to zoom in on your vocabulary, which is love versus GDP, for
yeah,
example. And I would say I kind of get this as a kind of the unmeasurable against the measurable. If I try, this may
sure.
not be later,
Go for
but
it.
if I'm a
Yep,
modern economist, in
yep.
modern economists to say, okay, we're talking about the unmeasurable love and the measurable GDP. Well, I
Hmm.
would be very careful about that. I would already say it's the measurable and the unmeasurable, but then I'd be very careful because the GDP way of measuring, I think, is flawed. So for me, it's not love against GDP. It's more like how would love be explained by an economist today if they used a better instrument for measuring? And
Yeah,
is helping. So I give an example. I'm not sure it necessarily did it, but in terms of the ironing, looking after children, all this, how do we not just value them, how do we put an economic value on house management and so on? I think a very good example of this was Marilyn Waring, way back in 1988, I think. She's this young sheep farmer, and 22, she became an MP in the New Zealand Parliament, and she was propelled to fame because her first vote as an MP was the one vote that stopped the nuclear-powered US aircraft carrier coming into Wellington. And so she went from a, a sheep farmer in New Zealand, an MP, just conservative in New Zealand, to stopping an American warship coming into New Zealand waters because it was nuclear powered. And so she became very famous. And then she developed already by 1988. She questioned GDP. And then the end of the story is the Canadian Film Board made this very famous film about if women counted. And her whole story was if women counted, how would you measure not just looking after the house or looking after the children, whether it's done by men or women, but how would you measure children on a pile of garbage in Manila? How would you manage all this devastation around the world? and she got the United Nations to accept a widened way of understanding things. And so I'm saying that because she wasn't criticizing measuring, she was criticizing the GDP way of measuring things.
Yeah.
So that's one point I want to make. And then a second point I would make, once you get into what kind of measurement, then I think you can talk about two special types of measurements. I'm speaking as a modern economist, there are things you can measure in front of your eyes. So for example, if you have a factory, you can turn the lights on and off at will. You can open your factory all day long, all night long. It's irrelevant to making things because you just turn the universe on or off. If you're farming, you don't have this possibility. So inside the universe, which you can make a box and you can turn it on and off, you can measure that very precisely in a particular way. You can do a cost-benefit analysis inside the entity. If you try and do this in the open field, you're going to have a situation where your costs will occur here and your benefit will occur there. It doesn't mean cost-benefit analysis is a problem. It just means you have to be very careful. It works here one way, but it works here in another way. So,
Yeah.
for example, a lot of costs will come to the farmer. The benefit will be in the community, if you say food.
Yeah.
But you have to find a way then to include the farm and the rest of the community in your calculation. And now you'll have a problem if you're just thinking like this. So I
So
try to say that because the love part of it is me just in my isolated modern place. I just have to include more and more people in my formula, in my equation, not just me and my own balance sheet and my own profit.
so
Is
this,
that
yeah, I think, and this is, in effect, what we're doing with nutrient density, at the Bionutrient Institute is saying, let's look at the way we're measuring food or the way we're assessing food, and we're saying pounds and aesthetic is not a sufficient definition. Nutrition has to be a piece of this understanding of what food is, and let's augment our definition so we can effectively shift the economics. Um, so I think
yeah?
that makes sense. I mean, what I want to stay as a through line of this entire conversation is what are practical take homes that we can each, garner from this conversation to, help transition our lives. And, the reason I'm having this conversation with you is because I feel like the uninvestigated, unconsidered background economic structure in which we all exist has some really negative implications in our lives broadly. And being able to understand that and then being able to take thoughtful changes in our lives will leave us more empowered. So I'm not sure if that starts or that a critique of what neoliberalism is relevant, but um, maybe that's something we should just at least touch on is, this is all great theory, it's all well and good, but what are the practical take-home relevant implications of this deeper conversation or understanding?
Well, let's try another topic. Let's try land. So
Yeah,
if we start with food, let's start with production of food. If
yeah,
you go back this way, you will not find land bought and sold in the market. No way.
yeah,
It's totally embedded in the community, and it
yeah,
doesn't only, classically it may be passes from father to son, if I'm allowed to use such a now it's politically incorrect, but if you go back into old ancient cultures, it was nearly always father to son. So I'm not advocating that going forward, but it's pretty much how it was. Um, and so if you had a farm, it went to your son. Your son didn't buy it off you, right? It just went to him. So he didn't have to start farming by finding 10 million pounds or dollars to go and buy a farm to farm. This is huge. If my son wants to take over my farm or my daughter, this is going to be a financial event. Even if he's my son or my daughter, it's going to go via the market, if only for tax purposes, if only for the
hmm,
government to have a revenue stream. So this is a huge thing, because if you look at farming back then, you never paid for your land. You may pay a tithe to your landlord, but you were not buying land or renting land. This is fundamental. But today, if you go in, if you're a young farmer or a prospective young farmer, even if you want to take over your father's farm, you're going to have to pay for that, and you're going to have to borrow that money. And now you'll be driven into a kind of farming which can earn the revenue needed to pay off the interest bill. So I just take that one example.
Yes.
Because a modern challenge today would be, how can we just get the value of land out of at least out of the farming economy? How does that happen so that the farmer has a chance to make money? I don't mean to make huge money, but if all a farmer can do is sell food to the market, he will never get at the price he needs if he's buying land in the first place. It's just not achievable. So I don't know if it's understandable, but the technical problem now is we have to undo this arrangement where we think land has a value and we charge you for it. That would take you into all areas of like how people try and solve it. So let's get lots of people to own my farm or whatever. But this solves nothing if they're still buying the land. Whether I buy the land myself for $10 million or 10 million people buy it for $1, I still got a cost in there, which wasn't there before the first Renaissance and needs to go away after the second Renaissance.
So this is probably, I mean, this is part of one of the biggest, um, uh, passions I've come to in the last year, is this question of land and land access and land tenure and ownership and not ownership. I mean, I think for starters, I would say, depending on how broad your lens is, we can look at a lot of indigenous cultures that would have said historically, not that I own this land and pass it on to my son, but that I belong to the land. And many of them, of course, were matrilineal in nature, and so there was a shift at some point from we belong to the land belongs to us, to the land can then be monetized. And I sit back from my comfortable place here, owning land, outright, not through a bank, but actually it's mine, quote unquote. And um, I feel like my life is coming from a place of ease because of that. And I see so many of my peers who are in this place of debt, mortgage, servitude to the capital markets, et cetera. Um, and I mean, to me,
Yeah,
this is one of the essential questions. How do we, what is a path? What would you suggest as a proposed path forward out of this conundrum? Um,
well, if I take your case you gave, which is the case for many people, whether we're sitting comfortably in the things we own or not is another matter, or our debt loads. But the point is, when you say you own a property, which is more or less what you said, you do what you have in law. You have exclusive right to use that property. That's what ownership means,
Mhm.
and you've got that by buying it. I'm assuming,
Yeah,
right? You haven't got it by everybody around you saying you can have that piece of land,
yeah.
but you bought that fact. So effectively, if you have exclusive right of use, it means everybody who's excluded from your piece of land have agreed that you can be on it for some reason. And you bought that right without realizing that's what you're doing.
These are
So
the
if
unconscious agreements of our culture. We don't actually even begin to.
you go back,
Yeah.
you would never be able to say, excuse me, I've got a lot of money and I'm going to buy that bit of land. You'd have to have a discussion with the elders or whoever, or the rest of the community, and say, okay, why you? Why not him? What skills have you got? Why do you think you're linked to this land? When we're clear about that, of course, you get to use it. It's not yours, right? But you get exclusive right to use. Well, all that's real. It's real today, except we've monetized it. And now we don't see that I can just barge into that conversation, throw a few dollars around, and all that subtlety of conversation goes, right? Uh, so I give that an example because we think we own it. In fact, we don't. We are allowed to use it by everybody who's not owning it. And we just need, just waking up to that fact. You owe the comfort of your ownership to everybody else who's not allowed to come on your land without your permission. You've
These are
got
the
their
unconscious social contracts that are part of the cultural milieu that we're being brought up in, that,
yeah.
we could argue is part of this neoliberal, experiment. Um,
Or it's more at this point. I know you're in Massachusetts, and I'm not nailing you on this. I'm
I'm
nailing
proud to be
administration.
from Massachusetts in
Yeah,
1776,
yeah,
100%. Yeah.
it's a very important date for lots of reasons. But You've got there, especially in that part of the world, by asserting your rights over who was there before. When the Europeans came to North America, the people there before just, oh, welcome, have some of our land. That wasn't ever part of the conversation, right? You came with your fences and everything else. You said, if you can walk around here in a day, it's yours. We've written it on a piece of paper, which you can't read. So if you look at the United States, you've asserted your right over what was there before. It may have been the right thing or wrong thing to do, but it was by assertion. It wasn't, you didn't say, excuse me, I'm coming from Europe and maybe I can use land better for all of us than you can. And they say, oh yeah, okay. And that's
Or maybe I can't. Or maybe I can't. And I don't appreciate the profound subtlety with which you've been managing this land.
So that's a conversation we never had to have because we just waved the dollar bills. We've got an army and a navy and we've got sticks to make fences. But we still need to have that conversation. The conversation will help us enormously going forward because it will resolve a lot of the angst going backwards. If you come to reparations debates, for example, we could say New Zealand or we could say Manhattan Island or wherever you have these reparation stories, they're very important to move forward, but they only will move forward if really, we can all forgive our past and say, okay, we should have the conversation. We're going to stop, have the conversation, start again. You might end up being the one everyone says, yeah, Dan, stay put. But at least then you can take your fences down. And well, so for me, that's part of what I'm saying. We've got here by asserting ourselves, and now we've never listened. Does the community really like what I'm offering? And it may be they would say, yes, now you've asked. And on we go.
And which community are we asking? Is it just the humans, or are we subtle enough to be actually engaging with the other beings of the land and gaining their, blessing to engage? There's a whole many levels of this, which is exactly what I'm wanting to bring forth here.
Yeah.
What is that path going forward? How can we, through our understanding of the way that we have presumed, the way that economics have, structured our life, what is that path forward, that upward path? Can you give us a vision of how to engage it?
Let's turn to our Australian audience.
Okay.
Because Australia is a great example, I think, of a hugely, a people, I'm talking about Aboriginal peoples, who were just part of the land. They lived with the land. And what we now know retrospectively, once we asked or once we inquired, leave aside all the nuances of that debate, was they just knew they were part of the land. They had no egotism involved. So they just knew what the land needed them to do and vice versa. And when the Europeans came, they just said, well, we don't think like that. We just extract. We put a fence around, we take it out. When there's nothing more to take out, we put the fence somewhere else and on we go until we end up with this level of debt. And there's no way we can continue. And now we're starting to wonder, maybe it's our extractive mindset that's the problem. And then we have to find a way to converse, in this case, with the Aboriginal people, take them seriously, think maybe they've got a greater wisdom than we have. And maybe we can even mimic some of their practices and learn what the land is speaking about. I'm saying this kind of in a big story. That's a huge story in Australia and elsewhere. But also when I've never been a big lander, but I have been responsible for land. And I've always done what I call walking the bounds. And walking the bounds is when you go around and you say, really, is this really where the boundary is? Is there a tree too many? Are we missing a tree? I don't want to say I'm a tree hugger or I don't want to talk to trees. You won't see me talking to a tree, maybe, right? But when I look in land management, this is, it's not for me to say whether there should be a pond or not. It's for me to kind of ask, is there a pond missing in this landscape, for example? And you take the clues from the landscape. This is a kind of, if you say you did this, you'd be said you're a tree hugger, you're Prince Charles, you're a kind of, one of the weird, you'd immediately get a huge critique on you. I can say it now because I'm old, right? And I don't mind saying that's what I've done. But if I was starting out wanting to get a bank loan, I wouldn't say I talk to the trees, right? But I absolutely would. But it's just me coming out of my boxing consciousness which I'm quite able to do if I want to.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what I have done on this land is
Yeah.
spend time, you know, through the year asking those questions. Does a pond want to be here? Oh, a tree is growing there. Well, let it be. Let me not cut it down because it's all that. I think this audience here probably is one that's quite receptive to that story, and I would guess many people already are operating from that paradigm and are looking for, you know,
Or it might be, for example, that from the point of view of your land management strategy or your farm, from the farm's point of view, it may be for your farm to be viable, it needs the field next door to you, which is not yours. And now you run into a problem because the law of the land or the legal construct or the finances will say your farm is here, but the farm is saying no, it's here actually. So you're going to have to do a deal with your neighbor, right? This if we start working seriously at the economics of farming, we will find many the legal or financial boundary of a farm, financial meaning I've got you as collateral, right? That boundary will not be the boundary of the farm, economically speaking. And now you're already in a problem. Because supposing your farm viability relies on having your neighbor's piece of land, how's that going
well,
to work?
I mean, so yeah. Let me sort of bring up the thing that I've been so passionate about in this last year as a sort of a proposition and see how this, factors or is processed through your frame. Um, I I I came across these books a number of years ago. They're called the Ringing Cedar series when I was started teaching my courses in, I think 2008 or so. Um, and various of the people who were attending said, "Have you heard of the Ringing Cedar series, the Anastasia series?" And I said, "No, I hadn't. No, I hadn't." And but I sort of conveyed the insights. I think it was just last year, I actually cracked the books and started reading them, and they were, um, as recounted by someone who experienced this very deeply indigenous woman from Siberia, who I think is probably between your age and my age, actually still alive, um, and her sort of insights, commentary, perspective from that non-colonized perspective. I find it really inspiring, really, really inspiring work. But um, one of the things she talks about there is the dachas, and in Russia, as I understand it, um, post the end of the Soviet Union, in their constitution is this right that every citizen has to land. Every citizen has a right to a dacha. I don't know what the scale is, if it's an acre or a hectare, which is effectively a place where you can build a simple house and have enough land to provide for a simple life, for your food, basic sustenance, etc. That's not something that you have the right to sell. Um, you may be able to pass it down to your progeny, or they could have rights to their own piece if they want. But that is a foundational right of all citizens right now in the country of Russia. Um, and for me, as a model, that solves a lot of problems. Um, for me, in my perspective, we all are wired with that capacity to have that deep intuitive knowing that you referred to the Aborigines having. They just somehow know what the land wants. I mean, I understand that we all have those antenna systems out of which we are built, that we're wired to be able to do that. It's just that in our early childhood development phase, when we're kept off the land and we're in buildings and on screens and eating processed products, our circuitry gets basically put out of tune, and those abilities, those muscles don't get built. Those muscles, those subtle perception and communication with nature. Um, so, we look at generationally, the more we're removed from the land, the more we're raised outside of a natural ecosystem, I would say, the more we are denatured. This is again to the theme of the conference. the fact early childhood development is a phase in life when you are most plastic, I think they say. Like the brain is like malleable, depending. You can be taught to know that Christ is your savior, or you can be taught to know that Buddha is your savior, right? And you'll and that'll be your truth. You can be taught to be a farmer. You can be taught to be a chef. Whatever those skills are, whatever those things you are experience early on in life, your sort of is where your core competency becomes. So foundationally, I see um, the future of culture being one where I think if we continue to be shunted off the route of relationship with nature, we're going to be denatured. We're going to um, um, degenerate, to have epidemic levels of chronic disease, to be unable to reproduce, to basically devolve, versus a dynamic where we're living in harmony with nature, and then we'll be able to continue to evolve in that symbiosis. So for me, if I was a 20 something and I had met someone I wanted to have a family with, and I didn't have capital, I didn't have access to land, it would be very difficult for me to create a dynamic where I could engage that renaturing process with my children, to have them be more in touch with their indigenous nature than I was, because of how I was raised up. And so, I see this as a model of everyone has access to enough land to live a simple life, as a way to move culture towards a deeper harmony and symbiosis, um, and away from this debt slavery wage dynamic. Looks like you respond.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. I would just say that there are dachas and dachas. Putin's dacha is not the kind of dacha you have in mind, I'm pretty sure, right? But I
Correct.
think your story, I was going to ask you, if you come away from a Tsarist and then a Soviet Russia, which is a hugely peasant carried story and everything else, what we call feudal, but possibly worse. If you find a modern expression for that, you came up with it at the end, that everybody has access to a piece of land or something like this. And I think the economic story, if it's going to come out of the particular case of Russia, which is not replicable everywhere, is that in a modern economy, especially when we have democracy and all the rest of it, we still need to get a modern version that everybody, in fact, at least in terms of food, you could say, we all have to effectively, you take the area of maybe the whole world surface, but let's say in a country, the area, and you have to divide that in such a way that everybody could, in theory, go farm produce their own food without any interference, meaning without finding that someone's caught the market and done all sorts of things and added to the price. Well, in a way, that's a back to the land story, and not everybody would want to. And I would say not everybody would be able to technically. So for me, it's more a question, what is the modern version of an economy where we've kind of said to ourselves, look, the first thing we have to do with our land is make sure that everybody is fed in a way which has the kind of consequences you're describing. It's kind of like putting food production out of reach of profiteers. Because part of my story in finance, in food finance, is on the one side the effect of giving land a value that just makes food unaffordable. The other side is the distributors who get hold of this food and they make tons of money out of the distribution process. And this has to be stopped or modified, because that is far more damaging than anything else. The money made in the supermarket world is just extracted from the economy, put in the back pocket of distributors. It's not put back into land values and teaching farmers or anything like this. So the problem we have now, we live in a different age. In fact, we don't live in the Soviet Union or in Tsarist Russia, but we still have this problem. How can we so understand, let's say, the economics of food production, that it's not in the market. It's a kind of shared resource and has to be managed as such, and not the basis of not the basis of money making. That's the way I would translate everyone having a dacha into a modern economy. Because if you just say everyone has a dacha, then you're saying everyone should have a small holding. But I don't think that's a fit in terms of everyone's intentions in life or the amount of land relative to the number of people now on it.
I completely agree that a vast majority of people living in London are probably not going to want to be back to the landers, um, um, which is totally fine. I mean, for me, it's a question of like we can understand that all these systemic issues are extant. What I'm looking for are practical, even pseudo plausible pathways forward around which we can organize and build social movements to try to, ensure that trajectory is going up instead of going down. And right now, I don't
Yeah.
see, I don't see that. And um, you know, I presuming we live in democracies, a lot of us here in attendance are, think we live in a democracy. Um, I think it could, if it can be in the Constitution of Russia, it can be in the Constitution of the U.S. or Kenya or Australia. Um, I look
It,
at
I
the
think I think the
money.
situation is partly caused by the idea that food has to be cheap. And if you make food cheap, first of all, that makes life very difficult for the producers of food. Secondly, you now live in an illusion. The kind of modern lifestyle a lot of people live is because they're buying their food cheap. If they had to pay the real price of food straight up, either directly or see how it's covered by taxation, their ability to denature their existence would be hampered. A lot
That's
of
what
our
they are doing. We are
yeah,
paying it. We're paying it in our diseases and the
yeah,
diseases of our children. We are literally paying it, and we are literally on a trajectory to die out because of the fact that what we're eating is not truly food. It is denatured. But I would
yeah.
argue, why should we be wanting to engage in such an economic system in the first place? You know, if you had land tenure, if you had,
How are you going to do? Well, okay. How are you going to disengage you and your comfortable piece of owned property? If you if
well,
if you
my
don't like
cost of my
engagement, you're going to have to disengage to match your philosophy. How are you going to do
my
it?
cost of life is dramatically lower than almost all of my peers because I don't need much money to live, which gives me freedom to do things in the world that I feel inspired to do, that I feel like a lot of other people don't have that freedom because they are so burdened with the logistics of maintaining their life. If you've got to pay rent, if you have to buy food, if you know, have a mortgage, if you don't have these foundational things, then you have to get a job to earn money, and you're in
I'm not
this.
one to interrogate you, but does that mean you bought your house with cash? How come
Um,
you're not? How come you don't have a mortgage if you have a property worth something?
well, I bought it at the in December of '08. It was a complete wreck. The I mean, the
Yeah, but you
house.
don't have a mortgage. But if you're not indebted, it means you don't have a mortgage. It means you pay cash or you have ready money.
Well, I had some cash, and I had a family friend who was willing to put the rest of the money in, and I had a private mortgage effectively, which I've paid off.
Yeah,
But the core cost was quite low because I got a piece of land that, it had buildings on it, but they were considered to be tear downs, and I was like, no, it's not a tear down, that's a fixer. And
yeah.
so, and that was 15 years ago, so it's taken time for me to get where I'm at now. But um,
So your argument would be, but in the different ways they can do it, people should kind of replicate your case. I don't mean your example, your case. So try and minimize the mortgage. Uh, you know that the way you got to your comfortable place without debt is a low mortgage, buying a low value place, and living a low, not a low life. What do I mean? A low
simple,
impact life,
low
right?
low cost.
Low cost life. So you have a lifestyle which is part of your story, and therefore you're presumably advocating others replicate this rather than try and just buy land, work it, move on, which is what a lot of people are doing. It
I,
seems to
I
me if
mean,
I understand your
I,
lifestyle
I have
choice,
I had a lot of privilege in that I grew up on a farm, and I had a
yeah,
lot of practical skills, and I could take a thing that was considered to be a wreck by almost everyone. This place was on the market for years, and everybody who came and looked at it said, "This is it's it's
I
it's
don't
not
have
worth
the
the
skill
hassle."
set.
And
I
I was
want.
like, "I'll take it."
Yeah.
But so
So
I mean, a lot of people don't have that privilege, but we do have the ability. We know how to build simple houses, small houses
yeah,
for low cost. We could conceivably get people set up on a piece of land if they wanted it for a low cost. I don't know. How do we unpack? How do we get out of this debt slavery that I feel like so many people are in? I mean,
well,
give me a viable plan,
this,
I guess.
this, this may not be lay enough for you, but if I make it, I haven't seen where you live, but if I make an image from what you said, and I'm driving by and I'm a realtor, I think, oh God, that guy, he's not making all the money he could possibly make out of that. He's got this lovely land, he's put that shack on it, or what he calls a nice house, right? So let's get him off there and let's get 6 stories on that piece of land. Let's make some money out of it. And then you'll have a situation where, why would I do that as a developer? Because the cost of the building on it won't change, but the value of the land will go up the minute I get you off it. So anyone who's doing real estate development, whether they're conscious of it or not, they're thinking land has value, and they're trying to get the value of the land up, not the value of the house on it. This never goes up, it goes down. So all you're doing, if I put a neoliberal realtor's hat on, you are repressing the asset value of your land with your low cost lifestyle. Well, that's fine.
Hmm.
But everybody walking around you is waiting until you go out of town, right? And we can get this back in the game. And no, let's get the land values up, because this is what most.
I was just talking to someone this morning about, like the logistics legally in Massachusetts of building small houses on property because I feel like I've got way more land than I need. And I see so many people who are constantly having to work hard to pay bills to stay at zero. And I feel like I've got the privilege of access to more than I need. And what are the practical logistics of how I can share it? And
You could
I
give
mean,
leases on all your bits of extra land for nothing. You get to
well,
own
there
the
was the
land.
logistics of building buildings. Most people want to live in a building. They don't want to just live in a swamp or whatever. So somebody has
Yeah.
to put the
What
cash.
I'm trying to say is that the problem in this modern economy is people think land has a value, and everybody is in this game. Everybody's trying to make money out of the increased value of their land, not the increased value of their house, so that doesn't go up. Everyone thinks land has a value, and in their egotistical mind, they want that value to go up all the time. This is endemic. You don't think like this, but everybody around you thinks like this. This is how the world's constructed. So if you
And
take
that's my
that
point. How do we change the way the world thinks?
by
If
thinking
the
like you do,
world's So how do we get there? What's the path? What's the strategy? What's the plan to create a dynamic where the the thought forms have shifted, where we've been able to build a structure that empowers people to live in a more whole way?
yeah.
Yeah, and that's the constant quest I'm
Well, if we turn that
working
to
on.
farming, it would be fairly simple to say that it's not the value of the land. The rent the farmer pays is simply a function of his ability to pay.
Hmm.
Normally, you say the value of the land is, let's say, 5%, 8% of the value. You could look on some register, when was it last sold? Oh, so it's 8% of this or 5%. And I would say, no, it's nothing to do with it. It has no value. But since you own it and the guy who wants it can't come on without your permission, you're going to ask for some money. And I would say, just ask him to pay what he can afford to pay out of his farming. Simple. Or you can say, excuse me, my land's got value and you need to pay me 5% of it. It's your choice. So it's really as simple as that. And most people say, no, the land has a value and you're going to have to pay me because unfortunately I'm on it and you're not, and you need it and I don't. So you have to pay me some money. There's no reason for this. I would advocate, if someone's really concerned about the effect on farmers, then you have to get some land in some place where you just say to the farmers, if you need any money, if I need any money for the land, it's going to be what you can afford to give me, and I'll work it out from there. And
I
this is not now the value of land being an agricultural rental. I mean, it kind of is. It means it's not the value of land is impacted. But if I want any income from my land as such, it's going to come from what the farmer can afford to pay me, not from what I demand of the farmer out of my property owning rights. And for most people, this is where the conversation would just stop dead.
Yeah. Well, not most people.
That's it. If you look at succession problems or ownership problems, it's really fundamental, as fundamental as that. And our economics textbooks say land has a value, and lucky you if you end up with some land, because you're rich against the person who hasn't got it, and now you will always
Well,
win.
and where we're at right now, broadly, culturally, is, there are very few people on the land. The vast
Yeah,
majority who are on it are in their 60s and 70s and, getting
yeah,
close to dying. That, most of the farm businesses are supported by subsidies from the government, without which those farms would not be able to be viable ventures. Like, I mean, in my mind, I think, okay, so that farmer is taking, what is it in Europe, 1,000 euros a hectare? Like is the basic going rate. That's just what you get, 1,000 euros a hectare. And that's usually ends up being the net profit the farmers have. So if you got a 200-hectare farm and you're getting 200,000 euros a year, well, and that land is worth 20,000 euros a hectare,
it's
maybe
it's it's
you
crazy,
take the
but
two you take the 200,000 euros, but you give me 10 hectares, and that 10 hectares then is available for 10 families to occupy. And every
I,
time the government is giving farmers money to farm on their hundreds or thousands of acres farms, that what the farmer does then is it gives some of that money back to the government, and then that can be made available for smallholders who want to have dachas, et cetera. I'm just trying to think from a
yeah,
practical standpoint,
no,
how do we shift? It's not about farming per se. For me, it's about culture. It's about creating a dynamic where human culture is able to be grounded, with music and song and relationships and meals and, closer to nature. That for me seems to be, well,
I mean, you
again,
could, if I take an American example, a current example of I don't know if I don't know if he will agree to it, but anyway, you have Bill Gates. He has so much money. He's got more money and knows what to do with it, but he has no image. And of course, he gives lots of money away, but he has no image that the fact he can go and buy whatever farm he wants, and he owns huge amounts of farmland in the United States. If he would said, and now I've got all this, I give it zero value, he could lease that land to a farmer for nothing. That would tank the value of his investment. He can own the farm, but it's not a live investment anymore. That's in his gift to decide to do. And anyone who owns land can decide to do this. I will not use it as a source of revenue. Simple, right? They will have to make adjustments, but it would mean, for example, you can give a lease to a farmer, which is you get to use this land, it's never yours, for 50 years for farming. You will never have it. You can't put on your balance sheet, so you can't borrow against it. You're just going to have to farm, but you don't have any rent. So your chances of being able to farm have now gone up. At the same time as you don't have access to this thing you can borrow against. That's all that needs to happen, and everything would change. Everything. And if I was to take an axe at the present situation, an axe is a bit strong, but what's the incisive thing that needs to happen, at least as far as farming land, land used for food production land, at least that's the focus. That has to go down to practically zero. So the farmer never has a cost which he can never recoup from farming. The other way around, he could say, when I've paid for my kids, my family, their education, everything else, you can have some money, but until then, you're not getting any, which is like saying a zero rent. But the important thing is, the farmer gets to use the land, he never owns it. The owner gets to own the land, he never uses it. This is critical. This has never been resolved in modern thinking. And if you say this, people just freeze up immediately. Just the idea that I don't automatically use what I own is for most people impossible to imagine, because for them they just conflate the two.
yeah,
So you just undo these two things, and it will show up. And I showed you where I live, and this guy, one can
yeah,
debate what he's doing. He's bought all these properties and rent them really cheap to artists, so that blah blah blah. But what he's done, he's tanked the value of his. If he gives me a lease at a very low rent, the value of his property has now gone down. So he can push that all the way to zero if he wanted to. It's
Yeah.
up to him. And so this is the technical thing. If we don't do that, there is no amount of what's the word? I don't know what cultural changes people have to go to, how much music they have to play, or what to get to this point to do this. But it's two-way. It means the guy who owns has no right to use. He has to forget about the use, and the guy who uses it, or the girl, has no right to the asset that they're using. So they can't go to the bank and say, if it doesn't work out, it's okay, you can have the farm. That means they won't be borrowing against the farm. That is a
Yeah.
huge problem for the banks. You mean I've got to lend it to you as a farmer? How do I trust you? I'd rather have your. So it has a, and if you decollateralize lending, most lending is collateralized to land, not to a house, to land. If you break this relationship, you will collapse the banking system overnight because it's technically built on collateralizing the Western banking system is.
Yeah.
So this is absolutely the I don't want to say axe to the, but it's the incisive moment. This will decide whether we're going this way or we continue to go this way.
Yeah.
And it can be big. It can be a person does it, and lots of people do it. It can be a change in what you in the States would call zoning laws to require it to happen. There's lots of things could happen, but that's the basic concept. Separate land ownership from land use, and the rest will follow. Because when we get down here, we put those two things together.
And that
Understand?
has to be done through people being enlightened within themselves who have ownership. Is that the vector is people
Yeah,
having
because it
aha.
sounds it's a bit quick to say. It sounds a bit strange, but in reality, I think the reason we did this when we were coming down, my identity was
Yeah.
with the community. When I get down here, it's with myself, and if I
Yes.
can't find some meaning in myself, I'm sure as hell going to find it in the value of my land. It's almost
Hmm.
a psychological issue, and that will come from what use you're going to make of it. So a lot of people, if I say to a shop, okay, you get to use my shop, but you're not owning it, that means you have to make money out of what you do. That means you have to serve people's needs, because you can't come and you can't say, okay, I'm losing money on my business, but luckily the shop is going up in value, the building. I've
Yeah.
just removed that possibility. So now you're going to have to do something your customers want, not something you want. And now you're going to have some identity issues to resolve, right? And if you can't do this, you as sure as hell want to own the building.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about this. So in the end, it's what you would, I think, call cultural. I never start that end, but it is deeply cultural when I have to find my identity in being a shopkeeper, not saying, oh, well, I'm not making money on the cafe, but luckily the market is
Yeah.
pushing development. And so I just wait until I go bang, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have to, you're going to have to serve coffee that people like and open when they want to open, not when you feel like it. And so on. So it is a huge for the independent anarchic individual who wants to do what he likes. This is a huge cultural challenge to do
Yeah.
what the community values and not what he thinks is important.
Well,
And
I'm starting to see some people putting questions in the Q&A, and I
all
think
right,
Sarah showed up, so I think it's good. I'll just one last point. I just yeah, so I don't want to open up a whole other can of worms, but um, I look back, I think, to the anthropologists, who've studied more indigenous cultures, and they found that the number of hours a day of quote unquote work done in these cultures was 2 or 3. And, um, you know, so, I mean, my first question to this, like, I want to be a shopkeeper. I don't want to be a shopkeeper 10 hours a day, maybe for 2 or 3 hours a day. But, how can we create a dynamic where the actual amount of work needed to be done to maintain a life is low that, then gives us time for culture and community. I mean, maybe I'm just sort of too much off in fantasy land, but I think why not aim for that? Um, I do want
I'm
to I do want to
speaking.
bring in
I'm,
other voices,
I'm
but yeah.
just on that one. I'm speaking at the end of my career. At the beginning of my career as an economist was the question I put to my father. Dad, Karl Marx said in the early 19th century, we need to get to an 8-hour day. That means now we should be at a 4-hour day, Dad, doesn't it? So why
Hmm.
are we on 12-hour days, right?
Yeah.
So that was one of my first thoughts as an economist. How come we're working more and more and more when really we should be down all on that. We just do a morning or an afternoon. That's enough, right? And I would say it all goes back to the problem I said 5 minutes ago, right? We're having to pay for something which has no real value. And if you buy something, if you go and buy a car and it was a dud, you've got to buy another one, right? You're going to have to work a whole other week to get back to where you were on Monday morning. And that's the effect of paying money for land.
Yeah.
It's totally inflationary, and nobody can catch up with that problem.
All right. So I've got some questions here in the Q&A box, and anybody else who wants to engage in the conversation, it's been quite rollicking back and forth. Feel free to post there. Sarah, I see you have.
You're going to moderate, right?
I'll read the questions and bring them forth, so you don't need to worry about it. Yeah. Sarah, I see you having signed in. You're the one who introduced me to Christopher and have known of his work for some time. Do you want to pose any questions or engage as well before I start having the Q&A boxes? You have to unmute yourself if you want to.
Unmuting is always helpful to start. Hello. Hi, Christopher.
Hi,
and hi to the audience. It's a pleasure to have introduced you to the community. So I've had the privilege of attending a few of Christopher's workshops in Australia, and am more familiar with the structures proposed or the context from which Christopher approaches some of the thoughts he's putting forward. So I've got a number of notes that I think you got to the essence of where we're headed in terms of what are practical outcomes or steps that people can take to actually activate that change in culture, to be able to release the economic burden that is on farmers. Like, that actually is a huge barrier to entry for new farmers, because of the huge, as Dan, I think you mentioned earlier, there's such a high proportion of older aged farmers that are getting to a point where it's going to be, well, where is the next generation? But how can they essentially enter the food production, the farming area, if there's a huge economic problem to even begin, which then puts them behind the 8 ball. And for those who haven't seen or heard, there's a fantastic movie in Australia that was actually released called Just a Farmer, and it was based on the fact that, and it's a worldwide phenomenon, that farmers often have a high suicide rate because of that economic burden on them, and when a bad season comes, then they can't meet their obligations. And so effectively, instead of just, saying, are you okay, mate, which is the general way of solving it here in Australia at the moment, and just, putting an arm around the farmer, what can we, looking at the economic structure, the root of the problem. I know that there's a few programs in place. For example, Christopher, you've put forward a model that actually already exists for those wealthy enough to understand. They've created a stewardship model, which would be the way that I'm supposing, in plain terms, you're putting forward, as we're caretakers of the land, which aligns with Dan's, Indigenous understanding of, like, let's get back to the land, let's renature. The stewardship model is, we don't own the land, we manage it while we are, caretakers of the land. And therefore, I would propose the way that we put forward, the way we change that culture, is having access to information on how to structure that stewardship model across different cultures. There are many different ways, because of the various continents, there are many different ways, but in Australia, for example, Christopher, you put forward having there's a board of trustees, and I know for context, in which you haven't mentioned, Christopher, that you're involved with a really interesting property in Switzerland called Labier, which has a model of operating to associative economics, which effectively means that they've got these multiple businesses that act as caretakers or stewards of the land. And not everyone is doing the farming, but they're all engaged in a way that effectively, in modern terms, it might be called a commune, well, in Western society, but effectively they're each contributing in their own, which the best of their ability in their passion skill area. So you've got, I think you've mentioned there's the dairy, there's the restaurant, and within that there's all the subsets of people doing their part to contribute. This is really long-winded way of saying, basically, from what I'm hearing, Dan put forward, the Russian model is also the stewardship model, but it's currently only available in the Western world to those who know better. Effectively, Christopher, it sounds like you're putting forward a feudal structure where if, for example, Dan was to lease out his land at a very little cost, but in return for whatever the farmer can give, that effectively would mean perhaps the farmer's giving vegetables or whatever. And the biggest barrier I see is trust. And knowing that you've got the background in Switzerland where the laws are different and they actually have more of a sense of trust, whereas in the Commonwealth nations, because of the origin of the countries, there's been an erosion of trust for those who are in authority because of the way that the land was actually taken. So from your point of view, to try and translate it to those who aren't really into the economic structures or feel like it's, you know, just not something they've got bandwidth to explore, how can you access, like you mentioned, for example, you need to do a deal with your neighbor to basically have access to, if the land suggests that part of the neighbor's property is required for your functionality as a farmer. You're suggesting your word is your bond, and you, between farmers, you'd be able to develop that relationship. What are some practical steps there that you can see or that you've seen in the Labier model or in your past dealings that actually...
I would just say general and generic, because in that last example you gave, if my farm needs an acre of my neighbor's farm or my neighbor's land, I would knock on his door and say, look, my farm needs some of your land. And he'd say, well, you mean you want to own it or you want to use it? And I say, oh, no, I only want to use it. Okay, so you get a lease. It's not complicated. And then he say, how long do you want it for? And I said, well, it's a farm, so I'm going to be here for 30 years, so I want it 30 years, and and so 30 years, okay. And he's going to say, well, how much? And I say, well, how about if I've got any left over, you get that. And then he say, fine, and that becomes a lease. Very simple. And then I get the right to go on his land and farm it. It's never my land. I can't go to the bank with his land. It's not complicated. He loses the use of that bit of land in favor of me. He can still take it to the bank if he wants. It's really as simple as that. We just use a modern lease system to describe a lease in favor of the user and not in favor of the owner.
So
it's
that the term is the complication, as I see, and in terms of how do you actually write that as, oh, whatever's left over? Like, have you know, how would that be put forward in a contract? Because what we're talking about is contractual.
I think in a modern economy, and in the case of Lobier in Switzerland, you'd have to prove it in your accounts.
Yes.
And so a large part of what I do, a large part of how I interpret things or analyze places, okay, let's see the accounts of both parties, right? Let's not talk in vague terms. If you say
war room accountability, yeah.
If you say you need it for 30 years, why do you need it for 30 years? Where's your 30-year plan for your farm, which shows you need it for 30, not 25, not 50? Or, show me, and I'm going to show you my balance sheet, and you're going to show me yours. Because otherwise, we have no ground in an anarchic, separated world, right? Yes, we can talk about trust, but we're never going to get trust except first we see the numbers, right?
Yes.
There's no other way where I can actually trust you to know what you're saying. I can trust you, but you may be completely useless in terms of your financial literacy and skill sets. I don't know, right?
Yes.
So for me, all this is critical. You have to look at each other's balance sheet, so you know exactly the impact you're having on each other, and then you'll find the point where you agree. Until you do this, you won't find this point of agreement. It'll just be a tennis match with knowing the effect on my balance sheet, you know the effect, and we keep going until, in fact, we've seen each other's balance sheet. So you can just move that story forward. Really, I'm
That's a
serious.
No, no, no. And I get it. And
Yeah,
you're really speaking to my passion point here because what you
yeah.
just said on an individual level is actually what is happening in by way of corporate reporting. It's bringing that transparency
Yeah.
to the masses in terms of, I know you and I disagree on this, but
Not on
but
not on a Zoom all around the world. We won't disagree, Sarah.
But my point is going back to what you said earlier, food distributors are extractive and they do not contribute back to the farmer and the land. And yes, I can see that. What I can see, that's hopeful for those of you who haven't heard about like in corporate reporting, the ESG requirements, the mandates on companies larger than a certain size to have to give that information to their financial markets. I see that as a hopeful thing because they actually, all of these companies are members of the Global Asset Owners Forum. Not the corporations, but there is a thing called the Global Asset Owners Forum, which is actually all members of assets under management, such as pension funds, superannuation, 401k, whatever you call it. They are members of this, which actually means they represent our money for where it exists in that structure. And these large asset managed funds are actually subject to this corporate reporting, which means there is a level of accountability that they're subject to. How does that translate to the average farmer, or how does that help us? What it means is, and this I'm just getting on my soapbox, trying to translate what Christopher's saying to the general audience in the current Western framing, because a lot of Western countries have opted into this mandate, which is coming from the global level around sustainability standards, is that basically, if you look into into your government funding, into corporate funding, you will find that there are grants and there's money available to help improve those qualitative parts of the puzzle that aren't actually captured. Like you said earlier, you were saying, well, if people were to pay the true price of food, it would actually cost a lot more. And what that means is, the subsidies that you were mentioning, Dan, like most farms operate on a subsidy basis. They're only able to be viable because of their high debt level, because of that government subsidy. In effect, that's actually helping them stay on the farm and to be able to manage that land. But in a community sense, if you're a small landholder, you can access grants to help you overcome that barrier to entry. My argument is that nutrient density is the best form of actually creating that economic driver to reward the farmer, but also to give the consumer an understanding of the best land management practice, the best stewards that are actually creating good food. And there's a lot to unpack in that, so I'm not going to go into it. But I would suggest look into your local grants and seek that out from corporates as well, because it's actually a requirement for them to, if they want to show up and start looking less, let's say, elitist or extractive, they need to feed back into what is transitioning to for better or worse, more like a well-being economy, which is integrating the social impact and the environmental impact. So
All right.
that's my diatribe. Dan, I know you'd say, Sarah, okay, keep it concise. I'm on my passion project
It's
subject.
all
So
good. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, and I personally am of the opinion as a farmer that the more well you work with the land, the lower your cost of production becomes. And so I'm not necessarily in agreement about this sort of assumption about, you know, good food has to be expensive or anything
Yeah.
like that. There's a series of assumptions in there which are not necessarily founded. But we have set aside the last half hour of this 2 hour session for attendee questions. So I'm going to try to focus that and keep to that. But thank you, Sarah, for helping to translate and bring forth some of the pieces that Christopher has been trying to bring forth, but without me be badgering him so much. I'm gonna go from the top here. Adam says, who are the decision makers that could make rent-free land use for farmers? This is a fascinating idea. What would need to happen for this to be a mainstream thought? I'm not sure if we've covered that already, Christopher, but do you want to give it another pass?
Well, I would go straight. You know, if I'm going to farm, let's start from the point of view of a young person who wants to farm but is not coming from a farming family. Let's get into the future, or let's get to this part of history and not that part. So I come out of nowhere, and I don't have a farming family. I've never been on a tractor. I've never whatever, and I just decided I'm going to be a farmer. Okay, let's start there. Now you have a problem, because first you need a farm. So how are you going to get your farm? Well, you can either go to the bank and buy it. You can find a piece of land and buy it at whatever the market rates are and borrow the money, mortgage already to the bank, or you can say, look, here's a lease, and I need I want a piece of land for 50 years. I'm going to do this. It needs to be so big. You map it all out, and I've already signed it, and I'm going to pay what I can afford, and I just need someone to sign the other side of this lease. And you can hang it out and you put it on the internet. I don't know what you do with it until the person who has land willing to let you have it for 50 years or whatever you can pay signs it. There, now you have a farm, or you're stuck. The only other way is you raise the capital and you pay someone the market price for the land, and now you're stuck again, because now you've got to refund all that out of your productivity. So for me, it starts with a lease in favor of the farmer in this sense. And that could be Bill Gates says, oh, let me try that out on one of my 1,000 farms. Let's see if it flies. I don't know where the decision's going to come from. Or it could be a bunch of people say, let's pool together and create $1 million and then hand it over to this and then sign the lease. The people who make the decisions were the people who sign this lease. They will make the decisions. And it's up to them whether they insist that land has a value on it, and whether they insist the farmer will remunerate that value to them. They're the decision makers. And this concept will be, it's hidden. It's the assumption made in all law, in all policy. The assumption is land has a value. We'll get that assumption out, and you will have enabling zoning laws. You have enabling bank systems, which will say, if you want to farm, I'm not taking your land as a collateral. You better farm.
Yep.
And what you're going to get from me is complete confidence as you as a farmer. Not, I don't care whether you succeed or not, because I've got your farm. If you don't succeed, what do I care? And this will change. You will then find, you will get back to an old banking system. You lend to the asset, you lend to the farmer in this case, not the farmer's asset. This is the old banking system. We have to get back there. That has huge consequences. It will collapse the banking system, because when we came from that, the reason we came away from that is you said, oh, land has a value. Let's lend against this. And this destroys all community existence by definition. And so we have to just unpack this in favor of the users of the land and not in favor of those who own it. They still get to keep their asset. They can brag about how many acres they've got on the other side of the moon. Who cares, right? They just don't have to go and farm them, because luckily they've got someone taking care of that who they're not charging for the privilege.
Yeah.
If anything, they're paying this person to look after their asset. That's fine, no problem.
I know there's land trusts here in this bioregion in Massachusetts that have people who have donated their land to the land trust, or have sold the development rights. And, I think in every small town here, there's literally thousands of acres that are owned by these land trusts, and they're looking for people to take on 99-year leases, et cetera, and they're having a hard time doing it. So for those who might say, like, where will you find this land? I can tell you that, I know lots of parts of the US where there are these things called land trusts that are looking for people to take on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's
at no
none
cost.
of this is rocket science. So you find examples of what I'm talking about. They're not really examples of what I'm talking about, because most land trusts have collectively bought something which an individual would have bought. So it's still $1 million, whether it's bought by 50 people or one. So the land is still there. If they've given that money, maybe together they've given this money, so it's gone off their balance sheets. It's really on the balance sheet of this land trust. If this land trust now said, farmer, give me the lease where you want this land for nothing for 50 years, that land trust can sign that lease. It would tank the value of its asset to zero. That's all right if it's been given the money, right? So all these land trusts, they're still playing the game that land has a value. And so if they want to complete that story, they just have to sign a lease which says they do not get to use this land. They cannot get it back. They can sell it to whoever they want, but they don't get the use back until the farmer retires. That would tank the value of that asset to zero, or it would reveal a market for those who want to invest in land which earns them no cash for 50 years. There are such people.
Okay, stewardship. Yeah.
It's not stewardship, because this person's not a steward. You transfer the use of his land to this guy. You have no control over him.
But you have
He's
trust
now
in
the
that
farmer
steward.
of this land. You're the owner, but
Yeah.
he's the farmer. And
Yes.
and it's not I don't like the notion stewardship, because it has the implication I haven't taken hold of this land. I've got to take hold of this land. I am the farmer. And this is, in the case of Lobia, this is exactly what happened. When we neutralized the ownership of the land by putting the asset into a private company, and we put those shares, so to speak, on the market, that's easy. Now we could get our land investment back by selling the shares to other people who have no control over the farmer. But now we had the problem, who's going to farm this land? And when we interviewed people, in the end, one guy said, you probably know the story, we interviewed several people, and then we ended up with one of the people. And he said, I told you I was the farmer in the first place.
Yeah.
And so you come to this phenomenon. It's not stewardship. When you'll find this in ancient community, you will know who the farmer is in your community. And to this person, you entrust the land. This is the ancient way of doing it, right? It's not stewardship.
The devil's in the details of the term. What I mean by stewardship versus what you mean.
Yeah, okay. You may mean something more precise, like I'm saying, but someone who really can live into this land, not just look after it. This 100%. Is more like what I would say in the terms of the Lobia, if you want to use that example, the investors have gone into stewardship mindset. They're there to keep it all nice all around, but they depend on the skill set and the competence of the guy who's now got the lease. Because if he's useless, now we have a big problem. First of all, we don't have any value, but now he's wrecking the land. But it's his land; he's got the use of it. So I'm very picky about this because this is how you will find your farmers. And often, if I come back to the young people, they would discover their farmers by farming, but not if they have to farm in order to pay debt. This will include their farmability. You know, they may come out of nowhere, but a lot of people today, they discover who they are by doing things which don't make sense to begin with, because your dad was never one of those, or you never went to this or that, right?
Yes.
Give them the chance to do what they think they're going to do without debt loading them, and they become what they thought, what they had in the back of their mind. So for me, this is very real going forwards. Right? We just have to accept that when a young person coming out of nowhere says, I am going to do this, he or she has a reason, and you just need to finance it so that they can, because you can also finance it so they cannot. Very easy to do that.
I'm going to move on to the next question. Katrina asks, what's that?
You control me, because I get very passionate.
Well, between you and Sarah, I can.
Yes,
it's quite difficult not being rude.
Bye, Sarah.
You both just have to practice sensitivity to those around you. Yeah. Katrina asks, Christopher, are there any countries on this planet at all that might be or might have ever been running their economy in line with your work?
I would say, as a kind of guess, going backwards, every country. I think that's implicit in any indigenous culture. So I would say we all start out there. And then you can see the more and more modern people come in those countries, even if they're not just colonized, but even indigenous people can get modern, so to speak. Then the problems begin, because you start monetizing things. You have your own self-interest, excludes so it's more about how you keep alive in a modern form what has traditionally always been in the background.
It's effectively the indigenous cultural perspective that is what is your, leading us back to, referring us back to. I'm not sure you're fully there where you're going, but the point is...
No, because you can go into many indigenous communities and they want, so to speak, they want out of it.
Well, the question is, how do you define indigeneity?
Well, I don't know. If I go to an ancient tribe, I'm sure as any, maybe in the Amazon not the case, but you can go, if I go to sustainability coffee farmers and this kind of thing, quite often in their mind, they're trying to get to Hollywood. it looks nice for me to, but often in their mindset, they're trying to get out of their situation, to get to the capital city, to get to whatever. And so I'm not sentimental about, you have the same process in indigenous communities. They often want out, and they will run into the problem. So it's more a question, we're all going to have to go through this filter of saying, I'm separate from the community, and now I need to re-engage. And then we'll all have the same problem of it looks like a Western thing, but it isn't a Western thing. It's anyone who gets to this place who says, I want out of this community.
Which I would argue is this difference between the indigenous and the colonized mindset, not the Western versus anything else. But that may be a topic.
Not necessarily, because if you look at how a small coffee grower in the Andes is financed,
not indigenous whatsoever.
You're saying why? Why is that?
Because they're a coffee grower which is engaging in a business for global export. They're not, let's look at the way that the Aborigines were living when the Europeans first came to Australia. I would call that an indigenous.
So you mean you're not farming for a market?
Precisely.
Okay,
actually living in culture, in community, on land, without ownership. It's a whole different set of paradigms that are operational.
But in economic terms, that means you're not producing for a market. You're just producing what you need. So, for example, if you go to New Zealand with the Maoris and their constant struggle about fishing rights, the Maoris don't obey fishing rights because they fish to eat today. They don't fish to feed Auckland. So they don't have any idea, why should we have quotas? What's the point? We're only fishing for today. So if that's what you mean by indigenous, that's fine. But that's like, in economic terms, that is not producing for a market. So, okay, that makes it very precise.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't think we have time to hash that one out with all the questions that are here, but we can maybe address it at other presentations during this conference.
Okay.
It is certainly a topic of
I hope this is useful for the next 10 sessions. I hope this is a useful starting place.
Yeah. All right. So Sue asks, what is a farmer? How does one prove one is a farmer or capable of becoming a farmer or a good farmer or a bad farmer? What guarantee would a landowner or land trust be looking for? What needs to happen first? I mean, that may just be it just needs to sit there and resonate because, yeah.
Well, I don't know, because I think for me it's fairly easy. If I say I'm a farmer, right? The first thing I need is a farm. So if I've got the cash, I go and buy a farm, and I'll find out whether I'm a farmer or not. I will not doubt myself. But if someone came to me and said, "Excuse me, you've got $1 million. Why don't you go and do something else? Because I can farm," I would immediately start doubting this person in a way I would never doubt myself. So why do I doubt someone else if I don't doubt myself? It's as simple as that. It's simple as that. It is on that level. If someone says they're a farmer, don't finance them in such a way they cannot be a farmer. That's what I would say.
I grant your point that taking advantage of someone who wants to farm is systemically counterproductive. Yeah, how you know that you're viable, you have the skills. There's a whole other conversation there.
And he doesn't have an asset he can sell to get out of loss making if he turns out not to be a farmer. If you say I can always borrow against my farmland, this will stop you farming properly. So if you take this possibility away, you're just going to have to prove you are a farmer.
What I say is, get yourself, some land, because that's your right as a being, on this planet to practice living with land, and that's something you have tenure with. And lo and behold, it doesn't take much land to actually have a surplus to be able to sell. And if you wanted to scale up from there, that'd be great. But to me, the solution starts with foundational tenure for life, regardless. But yeah, we're allowed to have different perspectives. Megan,
can I may? Sorry, can I link
quickly.
Sue's question to Veronica's question? Because she's asked, how do you know what a farmer is? But I think there's a large part of reNaturing is actually listening to our intuition and following those whose intuition are speaking to them, and they show up, like Veronica in the questions. So perhaps, do you see what I mean? Veronica's saying she's a young Kenyan citizen with no farm, but much passionate in farming. Now to have a quarter of piece of land is costing me 8,000. Sorry, I don't
Kenyan shillings. Yeah.
Okay, and the same amount of onion seeds is 20,000 Kenyan shillings. Currently employed in private farming sector, earning 13,000 Kenyan shillings after taxation. So how could it be possible for me to achieve my passion? Potentially, the fact that you're asking that question means that it's just asking that question to elders. But if you guys could speak to that, perhaps.
This is my. Go, Christopher.
Sorry, I don't know. First of all, Kenya shillings makes me nervous because it sounds like you have a colonial story in the background. Meaning
That's just what they call their money, I think.
Yeah, but I always say, ooh, be careful. Maybe you should think about your own currency and not somebody else's, and not a currency governed by world markets, but your own indigenous abilities and everything else. That's the first thing. But I don't know the tax system in Kenya, so I can't comment on that. Coming from a generic, not knowing the case, if Veronica wants to farm, she'll, in principle, she has to figure out what, if it's, I don't know what a coarse piece of land is, but if the amount of land she wants to farm is enough for what she wants to do, then she has to find someone who will let her use it rent free for as long as she wants to farm. Then she's in with a chance.
I would say if the onion seeds cost 20,000 shillings, I would grow a few onions and save their seeds and start next year. But yeah, there's a whole, yes, of course, the nuances of logistics.
But then I've said that's the one side. If the land is if the cost of using land is nothing, she's in with a chance. I said the next thing is what is the real economics of farming? What is the price of food? What does she can sell out? What does she having to buy out? But if you take if you take land out of that equation, we're in with a chance. But now we have to go into tax law, what government subsidies, what the prices are, who controls distribution in Kenya. That's the other side of the story. But first, let's get the impossibility of paying for land out of her cost, and then everything would do with the distributor, where most of the pricing problems sit. The voracious nature of distribution, the use of government for all sorts of things, and I don't know what. So the farmer is always caught between the impossibility of paying for land in a modern sense and the impossible pricing coming from the distributor, because the distributors are the place where all capital comes free in an economy, and it should be plowed back in again, not put in the back pocket of Carrefour or Walton family or whoever else is in the distribution business, or the, that's the main problem. And, that's a much more serious problem even than the land. I do have a project where, for what I call true trading, where design a balance sheet where you show Mr. Distributor, Mr. Walton family, Mr. whoever it is, right, who's controlling all these markets, you deliberately put money in funds to finance farmers at their education, to capitalize them at rents, and to acquire land which they get to use for nothing. Put that in your balance sheet and make that you'll still have some money to live on. But the colossal amount of money that's extracted in the realm of distribution is our biggest problem beside the land.
That's where I was hoping you would land, because I know that Labia has models to actually help train up young interns before they get over a number of years, so that then they can be entrusted to be a farmer, which speaks to.
I think, I'm sure if you take this image, you will find examples of this all over the place without the economic concept as to why they're doing it. Right.
Yeah.
And for me, it needs to be more systematic. When you go to business school, and you're going to be a food distributor, you should be told your balance sheet will have 3 funds in it, in addition to your shareholders' funds. And this is money you set aside to put back into the overall economy from which it's been extracted, because you are in the distribution function as an economist. This has to be understood. Not that this is another opportunity for you to make money and get yourself yet another house, and to hell with the cost of land and let the farmers go hang. That's basically the business. That if you're a distributor, that's what you're taught. It's a profit-seeking operation. Lucky you, right? Because you're going to extract huge. The role of distribution in an economy is just to release all this capital. That's why merchant banks are so important. Capital comes totally free in the realm of distribution, and it has to go and find its way back in again, not be siphoned off in yet another yacht or yet another, power of the market, because I'm the buyer, so you can wait to the end of the year for your money. All the stuff that distributors do to farmers, they just need to stop doing it. It's really, and the price can be where it's going to be, because they can always make it, Starbucks, and I'm not mentioning anyone in particular, but you can, the amount of money you make on the froth in coffee in a coffee shop in London, you can easily fiddle around with that and pay twice the farmer what he gets. It's just a little less.
Could, but
Yeah,
it
to those who
requires
must have given.
it
Yeah,
requires a shift in consciousness in the people
absolutely.
who are in the
Yes, want to
place
do it,
where
Mr.
they don't
Starbucks.
have that shift in consciousness. So it just
Yeah.
feels to me like
Just
if only people were different, the world could be different, is basically what
No,
you're saying.
people are
Well,
different.
to
There are
that-
lots of examples of this, but no, everyone's saturated with the idea, no, I look after number one. We're all
Yeah.
saturated with this notion. So stop that notion. That's the cultural challenge, and it will follow. If you start
Well,
looking
then
after
the real question is how to stop that notion.
Yeah.
That's the
And to
real
that
question.
point, that's where
And I would
corporate
say,
reporting helps, because
I
it
would
actually
say
helps
it's
to inform
bring
the
people up on the
consumer.
land and not in front of screens and in schools.
Okay.
I would say if you bring people up in a lifestyle where everything is expansive and free and there's a different cultural zeitgeist, that is where the new norm can come from. But if you bring people up in this colonized,
Yeah, I agree with you, because actually that was my
then
childhood.
they're not going to magically just transform.
Yeah, but then you're going to have to organize the world just like the one you want it to be, and I don't have any problem with that.
That's why I'm saying, in this moment of turbulent political times, when there's very, very low buy-in to either right or left party by the vast majority of the populace, there's a center party that focuses on something like land reform or land tenure or some of these other central dynamics. I think there's enough dissatisfaction with the way things are currently to propose a set of political solutions. But again, I get ahead of myself.
The other day I was ferreting around in my archive and I found an article I wrote in 1985. It's called The New Economy Party, and its plank was take land out of the market.
Well,
so whether you're on the left or right with your green, brown, or whatever color, take land out of the market. That's if you really want to sort the mess out, right? But anyway,
we've got a question here from Emma. What's your view of universal basic income as a way of decommodifying our culture and rebalancing our lives? I'm asking this as part of the Basic Income for Farmers campaign, which is starting to get real traction. Our hope is that a basic income for farmers, starting with fruit and veg growers, will help disrupt our industrialized food system and support producers in the face of climate shocks and increasing economic precarity.
I'm not in favor of basic income. Because our problem isn't income. Our problem is lack of capital, actually. And if I go to any sustainable farmer or non-sustainable farmer, their issue is not income. Their issue is the way they get the capital hampers them from doing what they want to do and creates a cost which their pricing can never overcome. So I never start at the income end. I always start as how can we get the capital to the person who needs it on terms that enable him or her to do what they want to do. The income will then probably follow. So I, as an economist, I would never start at the income in basic or anything else. It's always a secondary problem. Most people's problem is they're undercapitalized or it's too expensive or not just on the money side that, you can go to a farm and you can just see this guy bought more land than he can ever manage, or he inherited more land than he can manage. So he has to get in sync with his land underneath him. Otherwise, the whole actual capital structure is defective. So I always start at that end because income is tracking on this. And
I think what she's saying is universal basic income is something along the lines of £10,000 a year, which could be considered to be capital, right? So if what she's proposing here is
not unless you use it as capital, it's just income. So in accounting terms, income and capital are not the same thing. So you can have some
you may need to get off of your high level of, economic technicality and translate for the lay audience then what is capital.
Well, okay, so you get 10,000 beginning of the week, and I would say if the end of it, someone has bought some land, let's say you get 10,000, and at the end of the week they spent 5,000 on buying land, that they then allocated this 10,000, 5,000 went to capital and 5,000 used as income. But they're not the same thing.
What's used for expenses.
Yeah, and when you income or what use for expenses, you've spent it, it's gone. You're never going to get it back. The car you've just bought, you've still got it, or the tractor or the piece of land. So there's a huge difference.
So you'd recommend a universal basic capital in your language, what she's trying to say. Would you be in favor of universal basic capital for small farmers?
I would say, I don't mind universal. I would say you universally capitalize someone to the degree that person says they need capital. That might be 1,000, 10, that number will be up and down. It won't be the same amount. So I have a problem as an economist when someone says basic, if they mean we all get the same, this is nonsense to life. This is an old Bible story, if you like, but for me, everybody should get the amount of capital that they say they need. And that's what they need. And most people do not have the capital they say they need. I have less or more, in fact. And this makes their income absolutely hopeless. You actually need the amount of capital, no less and no more. And most people are on one side or the other. And therefore, they cannot generate the income relative to their capital. This is complicated, you could say, but for me, it's axiomatic. And all these income issues, they're caused by the wrong capitalization in the first place.
Yeah.
You can go and scratch any farmer and you can see he hasn't got the right kind of capital in his balance sheet.
Yeah.
So I always start that end.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, we maybe time for one last question. Megan asks, Christopher, you say that the issue is that we are paying for something that doesn't have any real value. It's rather our concept of the value we get from the land. But I'm curious then, what does have value in this train of thought? What is value?
So I don't know if this works, but let's say we're all arrived, we're all been shipwrecked, and we arrive on this island, and there's nobody there, so we're not colonizing, we're not doing anything, and there's nobody there. It's just this island, and we all get on it, and now we decide, well, we need to use it to grow food, so we start using it, and then someone says, yeah, but I got off the boat first, so it's my land, so you need to give me some of the food, and I'll go and sit on a deck chair, and you do the. Why would you wouldn't pay him a penny? So why do we think land gives rise to a rent? It doesn't, right? It's just there, right? So it doesn't give rise to a rent. No way. It's nice to say a rent is the cost of land, but that's a kind of fiction. It's nice for the landlord to say that. It's only because he was first off the boat that he gets to say that, right? If we all jump off the boat together, no one gets to say this is my land. All they get to say is how do we share the use of this land to produce what we need? But no one gets to say, excuse me, it's my land and 10% of whatever we do comes to me, but not to the rest of you. You would never get away with that. They probably just shoot you or throw you back in the water.
So the value then is in the effort that's put in.
The value is coming from what the use we make of it. Well, it's from the use we make of it in serving other people, because you can grow carrots on that land, but if nobody likes carrots, you've just wasted your time. So it's not just the use, it's using the land to produce things that other people need, not the things I need.
Need versus want. Yeah, it's need versus, it's about managing, the expectations of that society too.
People who are allergic to carrots, they won't buy them, right? So you're wasting your time. So it's not just use, it's not just come away from the land ownership into use, it's using the land to serve your community. Otherwise it will have no value. Not only does the land not have value, but then what you do will have no value. It simply won't. Don't open a shop just because you like whatever you sell in your shop. You'll go out of business.
All right. One last good question here. We're almost out of time. Sue says, Chris, you've been talking about this since 1985. You just said, if you had a magic wand to make things work differently, what 3 things would you do?
It's a great question.
One thing I would do, let's try this. I would outlaw collateralizing loans to land and make it illegal. First thing I would do, in fact, right? The second thing I would do, I would require any foundation which sits on a pile of capital to spend it out over a period of 25 years. That's the second. That's enough. This would transform the whole universe in about.
That would socialize capital. Yeah.
Yeah. So I say again, outlaw lending against land, and require every foundation to spend out its capital in a period of 25 years. Every foundation.
All right. Well,
because otherwise, these foundations, what do? They buy land.
Mm-hmm.
So they will stop that. It's just, if you ask Harvard, where is it? It's $150 billion. It's in a lot of real estate, I bet you.
Yeah.
It's not sitting under someone's mattress. It's out there in the real estate market. It's acting as a sovereign fund like Qatari and all the rest of them,
Yeah.
So these two things are simply said, I'll probably be shot on my way out. But nobody knows who I am, so that's all right.
Well,
I'm not in America, Mr. Trump. That's the main thing you need to know.
This has been a rollicking conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has. And we'll look forward to next week. Thank you very much, Christopher, for coming and speaking, and thanks, Sarah, for your offers as well.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Till next week.
Thanks so much.